Good morning. So today seems to me like a good day, a good time to remind ourselves of who we are as Christians, of what we're about as the church. It seems to me like a good time to turn again to the heart, to the root of what all of this is about, what all of this is for. Because I imagine that many of us come here this morning with heavy hearts because of a tragedy in our town. And it was just last month that I spoke to you on the Sunday after our nation was shaken by an act of political violence. And if you're at all like me, you are feeling weary of the darkness of these days, of this time. And if you're like me, you come to church, you come here in part because you seek and you desire healing for yourself, for our community, for our world. And you seek and desire to be instruments of peace, as the prayer of St. Francis puts it, and to grow in the gifts of faith, hope, and love, as our opening prayer put it, quoting, of course, the famous love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, by the Apostle Paul. And you seek and desire to be people of light and people of life. And I think there's a good bet if you're here today that you believe or hope or sense that this kind of healing and this kind of growth comes through prayer and through practicing your faith, through being disciples of Jesus. And in today's gospel that we just heard, Jesus tells a parable about prayer and about the practice of faith. And in it, he warns us of a trap that we can fall into all too easily as religious people. And then he gives us a surprising and very counterintuitive model or example to imitate. Jesus tells us about two people going to the temple in Jerusalem to pray, a Pharisee and a tax collector. Now, over time, largely because of the Gospels and Christianity in general, the Pharisees have been coded as villains of sorts in our cultural imagination. But in Jesus' time, the perception of Pharisees could not have been more different. Pharisees were regarded as heroes, and tax collectors were universally reviled as villains. Pharisees were respected and revered for their perceived holiness, for their strict observance of the law, of the Torah, for their discipline, their dedication, their sacrifice. St. Paul, who I just mentioned, himself was a Pharisee before he became an apostle and disciple of Jesus. And in the Acts of the Apostles, he says he was a Pharisee, which was the strictest sect of his religion, the strictest sect of his religion. And so Pharisees were regarded as people of Jesus, by people of Jesus' time, as shining and spotless examples of piety. As the Pharisee himself says in his prayer in this morning's parable, I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. Tax collectors, on the other hand, were reviled. They were viewed as traitors, as collaborators with the Roman Empire, with the emperor, with the enemy, the occupier of the Jewish people. They collected taxes from their own people on behalf of the empire, and often enriched themselves dishonestly in the process by skimming quite a lot off the top. And so when Jesus' first hearers heard this, the setup and the contrast couldn't have been more clear. The Pharisee must be the hero, the tax collector must be the villain. But, right, you knew this was coming. Jesus, like he always does, turns everything upside down, on its head. He completely subverts our expectations and our assumptions. In Jesus' story this morning, it's the tax collector, not the Pharisee, who goes home justified before God at the end. And it's not for anything that either of them did, right? Because if we're just looking at external behavior, the Pharisee is clearly superior. Giving a tenth of all your income is far better than taking taxes from your own people and keeping some for yourself. Rather, the reason the tax collector goes home justified is because of the disposition of his heart, the condition of his heart. And likewise, the reason why the Pharisee is not justified, why his prayer seems like it's not heard, is because his prayer reveals a certain pride and arrogance. The Pharisee, precisely because of his virtue and his goodness, is self-righteous and contemptuous of others, judgmental towards others, full of himself, so full of himself it seems that maybe there's little room in his heart and soul for God, little room for love. And as St. Paul, the former Pharisee, writes in that chapter from Corinthians, "If I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing." You might have heard this at a wedding before, right? "If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." By contrast, the tax collector in this story, at least in this moment of prayer, we don't know what happens to him later, in part because this is, as far as we know, just a parable. But at least in this moment, the tax collector is radically honest and radically humble before God. In a real way, he is empty of himself. And when we are empty of ourselves, we can become filled with God, with the Spirit, with divine love. And this is a perennial spiritual lesson and perspective for all of us, all people, at all times, in all places. And I think there's an element that is particularly relevant for us today. Luke's setup for the parable is that Jesus told it because there were some in the midst of, whatever crowd he was in, who trusted in themselves because they thought they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. And that word contempt really jumps out at me today. Because I think it's fair to say that in so many ways we live in a culture of contempt. And that it is tearing our society apart. And it is very sad for me to have to say this, but so much of that contempt comes from Christians these days. A lot of American Christianity, it seems to me, falls right into the trap that Jesus is talking about today, that Jesus is warning us about today. This trap of regarding oneself and one's group as righteous and regarding others with contempt. And then therefore contributing, adding to the discord and the division and the darkness that afflicts us, instead of being instruments of peace and of healing, as God calls us to be. Now, a fair question at this point is, have I fallen into the trap by pointing this out? Possibly, but I don't think necessarily. Jesus, of course, teaches, do not judge, famously. But I don't think this teaching to not judge means that we aren't to recognize and to name sin and greed and arrogance in the world when we see it. Jesus calls his disciples to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Jesus, if you follow along the Gospels, you'll know this. Jesus never shied away from calling things out. In fact, he never shied away from calling people out. But he did so with love. He routinely called the Pharisees hypocrites. A hard thing to hear with love, but Jesus no doubt meant it that way regardless. And so it seems to me that Jesus' teaching not to judge is clearly not a call to remain silent or neutral about injustice in the world. It is not a call to adopt an anything goes attitude. Rather, I think Jesus' teaching to not judge is a call to never regard others with contempt, to not cast anyone out of our heart, to recognize and honor the human dignity of everyone, even and especially those whom we may feel are our enemies, or those who may feel that we are their enemies. I think Jesus' call to not judge is a call to see every human being, no matter what, as made in the image of God. And so if you desire to be an instrument of peace, of justice, of healing, of mercy, and reconciliation, which I assume you do because you're here, then perhaps Jesus calls us today to look to the example and the humility of the tax collector. Because true religious and spiritual renewal and revival does not come from pointing the finger outwards at other people and other groups, but it comes from or starts with an acknowledgement of our own condition, of our own brokenness, of our own shadow, turning to God for mercy and healing and renewal, becoming empty of ourselves, of our ego, of our pride, so that we might become truly full of the light and love and life of God. As the great Jewish poet and songwriter Leonard Cohen wrote, famously, you may know this, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in."